Well, thank you, Crosby, and thank you for reading the book so carefully. And thank you also for wearing the Monticello tie with Thomas Jefferson's signature. I'm very grateful to the Kansas City Public Library and their outstanding book program for the opportunity to give this, which is my first post-publication talk about my book, The Men Who Lost America. I particularly want to thank Henry Fortunato, who's the head of communications, Todd Boyer, who arranged the logistics so well, a sign of the quality of this program, and of course Crosby Kemper III, who mentioned he's director of the library. He mentioned that he was on the board of the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, which oversees Monticello. The foundation is also my employer, where I spend most of my time not talking about the British side of the American Revolution, but about Thomas Jefferson, whose retirement papers we edit as part of the great series started in 1950 of Jefferson's papers, which aimed to be the definitive edition, and which would have taken another 2 generations to complete, but for Monticello stepping in, so they will now be finished in 2026, and about whom we put on many programs, including international programs, the latest of which was in China, and before that in Cuba. I'm delighted to have with me today some of my colleagues, including the president of Monticello, Leslie Green Bowman. As you can imagine, it's a joy to drive in there each morning, and I was particularly lucky to have an office on the estate, which was used by Franklin Roosevelt in the 4 days leading up to D-Day. And this is where I wrote that book. And the nice thing is that it commemorates a very different moment in Anglo-American relations, and one that we can all celebrate, and one that's important to democracy on both sides of the Atlantic. Now, we know much about the Confederacy during the Civil War, but relatively little about the British during the American Revolution. It was a war seemingly that Britain should have won, and its failure to do so is often blamed on poor leadership. The book is essentially a series of interlinked biographical cameos which explain why Britain lost America. And of course, among the list of characters had to be George III, the last king of America, who shared the belief of many of his countrymen that Britain would cease to be a great power if it lost America. He was not responsible for the policies that led to the American Revolution, but he became the leading war hawk, and he refused to negotiate with opposition leaders who were committed to withdraw from America. Writing at the time of the Second World War, the Cambridge historian Herbert Butterfield described him as being almost Churchillian, vowing that he would never surrender, whilst any 10 men in the kingdom will stand by me. He called for sacrifice. We must stretch every nerve to defend ourselves and must run some risks. For if we are to play only a cautious game, ruin will inevitably ensue. This, I think, responds to one of the great myths about the American Revolution, that the British simply didn't care. They cared deeply. This is it's still the 3rd longest war in American history, one of the longest in British history. They made a very determined effort to recover this country. Lord North, this incidentally is a painting by George III at the height of the Revolution. It's in 1779. The irony is it's by Benjamin West, an American artist, and it's suspected by some historians that West was leaking his conversations with George III back to Congress, but it's George III in his most martial mode. He moved his principal palace to Windsor Castle. He had martial music played every evening, and his government was collapsing, and he simply said, if others are not able, I must drive. He essentially kept the government together during this period. His prime minister was Lord North, a reluctant prime minister who spent much of the war. He was responsible for the Tea Act. He was responsible for the coercive policies that led to the American Revolution. But when he realized that it would lead to war, he immediately regretted it and spent much of the war years trying to negotiate a compromise. He kept attempting to resign, arguing that he wasn't the right sort of leader in wartime, but he felt too beholden to George III, and he thought his resignation would lead to a constitutional crisis. And then there were the brothers who commanded in America after Bunker Hill. Sir William Howard and his brother, Lord Richard Howard, they were respectively great pioneers in military tactics. Sir William Howe was a pioneer in light infantry tactics, the very tactics that it was thought would be successful against what today we would think of as guerrilla warfare. And his brother was a pioneer in amphibious warfare. That's the use of the Navy in combination with the Army. Between the two of them, they managed to land over 16,000 troops on Staten Island in a matter of hours, one afternoon. They used craft designed by the brother, Lord Admiral Richard Howe, craft that were very like those used on D-Day, in which the boat would literally turn into a gangplank at the bow of the boat as the troops just charged off it. Lord Richard Howe, like several of the characters in this book, later became a major British hero. He was the victor in a battle called the Glorious 1st of June in the early wars of the French Revolutionary. And then we have John Burgoyne, who was a rising star in the British Army after his successful defense of Portugal against Spain during the 7 Years' War, the period which we in America call the French Indian War. I'm glad we have in the audience a great expert on Burgoyne who's published his papers recently, Douglas Edgerton. Crosby referred to the person he knew the least, and indeed I think has faded most from American history, and yet was one of the most important people in London, Lord George Germain, who was Secretary of State for America. He was the main architect of the war in Britain, and he achieved, and he was a veteran, a military veteran, and also an administrator who achieved a remarkable feat of sending more troops to America than the generals had requested in 1776. He always blamed the generals for losing him the best opportunity of winning the war. He felt they'd been more interested in negotiating a truce than in really waging the war vigorously. And most historians retrospectively would argue if there was a time this war could have been won, it was in 1776. And then Sir Henry Clinton, the commander-in-chief for the second half of the war, 1778 to 1782, who was expected to win with fewer troops and less naval support at a time when Britain was fighting both against France and Spain. The most cerebral of all of the British generals, he would obsess more than anyone else over the causes of the British failure. He even wrote out the dialogue of a dream in which he imagined Lord Cornwallis apologizing to him for the British defeat at Yorktown. His memoirs are the most comprehensive and the most detailed of any general